Hey guys, this is Scott Payne from PM Master Prep, and in this video, I'm going to teach you everything you need to know about the planning process group. Now, more specifically, I'm going to teach you how to ace 24% of the PMP exam. Now, that's a quarter. That's a lot of the percentage. So the information in this video is really, really important. We got to get into it. So how am I going to do that? The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to help you decode the 5 key questions that are driving all the work in planning. These 5 key questions are super important. They are the why. The why draws all the action inside this process group, and we have to understand these 5 key questions first. All right, so once we understand the why, then we're going to jump to the what. And we're going to understand what is actually accomplished in the planning process group. Once you understand the why, then you go to the what, and you got the foundation that you need. And I'm going to follow that up by simplifying how the planning process group is actually conducted. So we start with the why, we go to the what, and we end with the how. And at the end, you have everything you need to know to answer these PMP questions on the planning process group. Remember, 24% of your exam is in this process group. It is tons of opportunity in this process group, so let's get started. Now, we're in this blue column to the left, and we see that, wow, we just came from initiating, we're in planning, and look, there's a stark contrast in the number of processes, 2 in initiating and a lot in the planning. You don't need to count now, I'll walk you through it. So, it must be a lot more work, right? Yes, it is, and it's equally important as the initiating. Now, before we get into the actual processes, I'm going to walk you through the 5 key questions. Now, the goal of planning is to get an objective and defined plan that's going to guide us through this project. Okay, and it's going to dictate not only what we do, but how we act, okay? And so in doing that, the 5 key questions, and like I said, the why, you should be asking yourself why as we go through this class. Why are we doing this process group? Why are we doing these processes? Why are these inputs, outputs, and tools and techniques done? By doing that, you're going to start to really, really understand. So the 5 questions that define why for this planning process group are, we're trying to answer, where are we going in this project? You know, what the scope could be anything. What is the actual scope that we want to achieve at? So where are we going in this project? That's a key question. How do we get there? Meaning, like, what is the schedule? What are the actions that we're going to take? We're going to define that, the pathway forward. So we're saying, where are we going? How do we get there? What does it cost? It's a pretty good one, right? And the cost comes after how we're going to get there, obviously, because we want to know how we're going to get there, and then, oh goodness, what's it going to cost? And we can make different decisions off of that. And then, do we have the right resources? So as we go through this, we're progressively building on these questions. Do we have the right resources? And we're going to define that in the planning to get to where we want to go. And the last thing is, we're going to step back and we're going to say, what might deter us? Okay, what might slow us down? What might throw us off their track? What might be out there that could explode and cause our project to not finish on time or on budget or to finish the scope? So we have to nail that down now. So let's think about these 5 key questions. Now, we said the purpose of planning was to define a centralized, objective, clear plan of what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. And when I say how we're going to do it, it means how we're going to react and how we're going to act in the processes. Meaning, like, we're going to do things this way. When we have a problem, we're going to do things this way so we can clearly state it out at the beginning so we're prepared as we go through. So these 5 key questions of where are we going gets more descriptive in what we're trying to do with this project. How do we get there? Okay. What does it cost? And do we have the right resources, and what might determine? And if we were to look over at the planning, we're just going to do this for really quick. Where are we going is defined in this scope section. Hey, what's the scope? Where are we going? What's our baseline as far as scope goes? And we'll learn about the baselines in a second. How do we get there? If we look over to the side, that's in the schedule section. So that's all defining in a methodical, logical, process by process, stepped approach. How do we get there? Then as we go down, what does it cost? That's the cost section, those 3 things in there. And then, do we have enough resources? Look at that plan resource management section. That's where we say, do we have enough resources to finish this project or to do this project? And then as we go down to another big chunk down here, the risk section, what might deter us? So we're going to spend a lot of time looking at risk in much different ways, quantitatively and qualitatively, to see what our risks are and to prepare for them and to prepare risk responses. So as we go through, we started with this long list of processes and said, oh goodness, there's so much here, I don't know how to make sense of it. But really it all boils down to understanding that our purpose is to have a clear plan, a clear objective plan. So that's the project management plan, right? Okay. And then these 5 key questions. Where are we going? Scope. How do we get there? Schedule. What does it cost? Cost. Do we have enough resources? The resource management section. And what might deter us? Risk. So when we do that, things start to make a lot more sense. And understanding those whys is really helping us put a foundation that we can build on. Okay? So let's go a little bit deeper as we go through this. Now we just isolated to this one planning section here. You can see that, first of all, there's only 49 processes in the entire table. Okay? All process groups, all knowledge areas, only 49. Now 24 of them are in this planning process group. So that's about half, right? And then what it is 24% of the questions on the PMP exam come from this section. Now these middle 3 process group, planning, executing, monitoring, control, those account for 80% of your questions. So that middle bump is really where we got to get good, okay? We got to really make sure we're here. So this is the first one where we go deep. 24% of our exam comes from here. So if we got all these right, we got a 24. Hey, we're almost there. All right. And then really we got to know that this process group establishes, I want you to understand this, the project management plan. If this is the first time you've ever heard this, then this is a big deal. The project management plan is what we said. The purpose of the planning process group was to establish a plan, this project management plan. So as we think through this plan and we go like, well, how can you have a plan for all these knowledge areas? That'd be a big plan, right? Well, in reality, there's a project management plan at the top for integration management that says this is how I'm going to manage the integration of all the plans below. That's a key concept. I have a plan for the plans in a sense, the master, mother, creator, giant plan. That's the major project management plan. And then there are subsidiary plans for every single one of the knowledge areas. So if we were to go look through here, right? Look at scope management, 5.1. Plan scope management. That's a plan right there. That's a subsidiary plan. Okay, so we have a plan for how we're going to plan the scope. What methods are we going to do? How are we going to iterate our scope? What are we going to do when we have scope issues, etc.? We're defining all those things. We're not saying what the scope is in the plan. We're just saying how we're going to define the scope, how we're going to manage the scope, how we're going to deal with changes, how we're going to communicate, all these different things, all defined in the plan management scope. And that's just around scope. So as we go down to schedule, same game. We have a schedule management plan. The process is actually 6.1, plan schedule management. So we're developing our schedule plan. What method are we going to use to put out our schedule? How are we going to develop it? All those things that we work out. And we're going to just say how we're going to handle it. So you're setting yourself up, if you think of a bow and arrow in a sense, you're pulling your bow back to say, hey, this is how we're going to react. And then when you get into the process, you let the bow go. And that's when you actually do the work. And we do the same thing for cost, quality, plan, resources, etc. And as we see, every single one of the knowledge areas has a plan inside of it. So that's our 12 subsidiary. Now you might ask me, what are these 4 project baselines, Scott? Well, okay, we're going to go through baselines later. But as we define out what we're actually going to achieve, remember the 5 key questions. What are we going to do where are we going? What's the scope? Okay, so we're going to have a scope baseline. That's going to be the defined scope. We lock that down through the planning process. What's the cost? What's our cost baseline? The amount we're going to spend and how much we set for a reserve. That's the cost baseline. We lock that down in process. So it's not floating. It's not ethereal. It's defined, objective. And then the schedule. So those are the 3. Scope, schedule, and cost baselines all defined down, okay? And then we think about, well, we have these things defined. We know what we're doing here, how much it's going to cost, what the schedule, what the scope is. And then we say, how are we going to evaluate as we go forth? Because there's a 4th project baseline that I talked about, right? And that's the performance measurement baseline. And we're going to go through these in more in depth, but I want to introduce you to the topics. So the performance measurement baseline integrates all 3 of those, scope, schedule, and cost baselines. And it gets it in a way so that we can evaluate the baseline as we go through. Because think about when you go into a project. What are your bosses and everybody else ask you? How are we doing as far as the process goes? And that's all in the earned value management section, which, we define really well later. But they're going to ask you, how are we doing? You're going to integrate those three things in the performance management baseline. You're going to say we're ahead or behind of what we thought our baseline was, which is our prediction for the future for what we should be at certain points. So that's what we're trying to do here. We have 4 baselines. You know what they are? If you take a second and say them out loud to me: scope, schedule, cost, performance measurement baseline. Those are our 4 baselines. We're going to go through them later. That's a good thing to know. And then we have 12 subsidiary plans. Every single one of the knowledge areas has a plan. And we have the mother of all plans, the project management plan that compiles all these things. So think about that. That's what we're doing here. We're getting ready for battle in a positive way. We're setting our course, where we're going. We know how to manage it. We know how we're going to deal with problems. And we're setting all that now, and we're defining down our baselines. This is what we're actually going to do. And now when we think through that, we go, man, planning is a really, really important thing that we're doing, obviously. And so that's what we're doing through these processes. And we know that it's 24% of our PMP exam. So it's really a place where we got to understand. Now, as a side note, the reason why I wrote my book and I organized my course in the form of a real project, in the form of process groups, is imagine if we were studying these things independently. Everything: scope, schedule, cost. You would have your brain organized to say, hey, I'm thinking about the planning process. I'm thinking about, or the scope management, I apologize. And we're thinking about the scope management plan. And then we're thinking about how we define the scope baseline. Okay, cool. Then you would go through there. And then what it's taken away from you is the building kind of feel that you get from, okay, I'm doing my scope baseline. Got it. Now I got my cost baseline. Got it. Then I'm doing the schedule baseline. Got it. And they all progressively build and integrate. So by going by process group, you're really getting that feeling of what actually happens on a project. And that's going to really help you learn. So let's keep moving on. Now let's talk about the objectives. We talk about why things happen. All those questions that we talked about, the 5 key questions, are why. Let's talk about what is actually done. And we've actually hit on these in the last thing that I was just talking about. So what is done? These are the objectives. When we get out of planning, this is what we're trying to do. Now, number 1, we're trying to define and integrate the plans by which the entire project and each knowledge area will be managed. Now, that's a lot of information I just dropped on you. So think about it. Define and integrate the plans. So we know now that it's not just one plan. It's lots of plans. A plan for the overall project and a plan for each knowledge area. So we're defining those and we're integrating them, putting them all together. Think of it as a big folder. We have the major plan and then all the subsidiary plans for battle, okay? For the entire project. And it says, what we're going to do, and then how we're going to manage the project in each knowledge area as we go forth, okay? So it's really just setting guidelines by which we're going to do things. Now, the key output, as I talk through that, it's obvious. The mother project management plan and all those subsidiary plans. Cool. So that's an output. So see how we've gone from the what, or the why to the what. Those are the objectives. And those outputs are the how. That's the how of how you get those things done. Why? We have to define where we're going and all these things. What we're doing. Set up all these plans. How? We're going to use these project management subsidiary plans. So that's how the linkage is. Number 2 objective of what is done is to define in clear terms, what is and is not included in the project. Now that's when we're talking about scope, right? What are we doing and what are we not doing? Can't solve the world tonight. We've got to be judicious in what we think through and do that. Now that is the scope, right? We talked about the scope management section. And the key outputs there are the project scope statement. I'll define that later. The scope baseline, you know what that is now. That's defined what we're actually doing at a played out sense over time so we can understand what we're doing. And the requirement traceability matrix. Okay, so now you're going to walk through in more depth as we go through these processes what each one of those is. So you're going to understand that. But what we understand is we're defining in clear terms what we are and are not accomplishing in the project. All right. Number 3 objective is we define the course of action for schedule, cost, the activities, the resources, the budget required to attain the project objectives. Okay. So here's where we say the schedule baseline, the cost baseline, the resource requirements, and the resource breakdown structure. So we're getting granular in how we're doing things in the project now. We've moved from planning to actual things that we're going to do to achieve stuff. So as you go through each of the processes in each one of these boxes as we do, you're going to understand that at a greater and greater detail. So course of action, we're setting our plan. Okay, we're not just planning, we're setting a plan. All right, the fourth is to identify, evaluate, and plan for potential risks in project execution. All these things normally, this is where we're going. This is how much it's going to cost. This is what resources we're going to use. Very, very important, obviously, but we can't abandon what risks are. And we nail those down in the planning. If you look at in the planning process group, if we look at the risk section, we start from a risk plan. We know that's a subsidiary plan. Awesome. And then we have 4 processes from identifying risks all the way down to planning risk responses. And in between there, we're evaluating risks. We're performing analysis in different ways, quantitatively, qualitatively. So we're going to evaluate all these potential risks. And in doing that, our output is we got to have a risk register and our planned risk responses. Okay, so that's pretty simple. Risk register is all the risks that we think we're going to have, right there, defined out, objectively put down and evaluated, and the planned risk responses. If something happens that we put on a list, this is how we're going to deal with it. Okay, so that we're ready to go. We're not reacting with our hair on fire when something happens. We are prepared. And as anytime we go through this is always great. You'll be able to answer PMP questions, but you also want to reflect back on your actual project work, back at your job. And you want to say, man, am I doing all these things? That's the beauty of the PMBOK. And that's the beauty of how we define it in my book by each, in a process group way, is because it's going to help you reflect on your actual project work, and say, am I doing these things at the depth that I should be? So we just take that, okay? So where we are now, we've defined everything in the planning process group. You understand the 5 key questions. You understand the objectives. You understand the outputs. Now, what you need to do is you need to dive into the planning process group. And I need you to go from top to bottom, starting with develop project management plan. Let's go through that process and methodically work our way through. Now, if you go through as you're going through my course, you're going to see that you're going to have specific quizzes after each box. And what do I mean by boxes? You should know by now that each one of these little boxes we're planning and where a process group and knowledge area meet, and it's a little chunk there. You talk about those, and then we ask you specific questions from our simulator there. So what we do just-in-time learning to test your skills as you go through to know, hey, let's look at 5.1 through 5.4. We're going to define the box in the front. It's going to be another video like this. Hey, this box, scope versus planning, is all about something. I'm going to teach you. And then we're going to go through teaching you process. And then at the end, we're going to have John's case stories. And then at the end, we're going to say, answer these specific questions from the simulator. That's going to help assess your actual understanding. And what we need to be is we need to be honest with ourselves. If we miss questions, no big deal. That's why we're here. We're learning now. We got to go back, got to watch the videos again, got to go to my book, got to read that, got to go to the PMBOK, got to call a friend, got to go to the website, fill in go to the chat, got to ask people questions, go to my Facebook page, ask people questions so that we can identify and eliminate our weaknesses as we go. Can't wait till the end. We do this up front. It's iterative learning. It's just-in-time learning. So, all right, enough of that. Let's go forth, jump into develop project management plan, and I will see you there.